Chapter 7 of Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lee Ann Howlett. Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed, by Edna Ferber. Chapter 7. Blackie's Philosophy. I did not write Norah about Von Gerhard. After all, I told myself, there was nothing to write, and so I was the first to break the solemn pact that we had made. "You will write everything, won't you, Dawn, dear?" Norah had pleaded with tears in her pretty eyes. "Promise me. We've been nearer to each other in these last few months than we have been since we were girls, and I've loved it so. Please don't do as you did during those miserable years in New York, when you were fighting your troubles alone and we knew nothing of it. You wrote only the happy things. Promise me you'll write the unhappy ones, too, though the saints forbid that there should be any to write. And, Dawn, don't you dare to forget your heavy underwear in November. Those lake breezes! Well, some one has to tell you, and I can't leave those to Von Gerhard. He has promised to act as monitor over your health." And so I promised. I crammed my letters with descriptions of the Knopf household. I assured her that I was putting on so much weight that the skirts which formerly hung about me in limp, dejected folds now refused to meet in the back, and all the hooks and eyes were making faces at each other. My cheeks, I told her, looked as if I were wearing plumpers, and I was beginning to waddle and puff as I walked. Norah made frantic answer. "For mercy's sake, child, be careful or you'll be fat." To which I replied, "Don't care if I am. Rather be hunky and healthy than skinny and sick. Have tried both." It is impossible to avoid becoming round-cheeked when one is working on a paper that allows one to shut one's desk and amble comfortably home for dinner at least 5 days in the week. Everybody is at least plump in this comfortable gemütlich town, where everybody placidly locks his shop or office and goes home at noon to dine heavily on soup and meat and vegetables and pudding, washed down by the inevitable beer, and followed by 40 winks on the dining-room sofa with a German Zeitung spread comfortably over the head as protection against the flies. There is a fascination about the bright little city. There is about it something quaint and foreign, as though a cross-section of the old world had been dumped bodily into the lap of Wisconsin. It does not seem at all strange to hear German spoken everywhere, in the streets, in the shops, in the theaters, in the street cars. One day I chanced upon a sign hung above the doorway of a little German bakery over on the North Side. There were Hornchen and Kaffeekuchen in the windows, and a brood of flaxen-haired and sticky children in the back of the shop. I stopped, open-mouthed, to stare at the worn sign tacked over the door. "Hier wird Englisch gesprochen," it announced. I blinked. Then I read it again. I shut my eyes, and opened them again suddenly. The fat German letters spoke their message as before. English spoken here. On reaching the office I told Norberg, the city editor, about my find. He was not impressed. Norberg never is impressed. He is the most soul-satisfying and theatrical city editor that I have ever met. He is fat and unbelievably nimble, and keen-eyed and untiring. He says "hell" when things go wrong. He smokes innumerable cigarettes, inhaling the fumes and sending out the thin wraith of smoke with little explosive sounds between tongue and lips. He wears blue shirts, and no collar to speak of, and his trousers are kept in place only by a miracle, and an inefficient-looking leather belt. When he refused to see the story and the little German bakery sign, I began to argue. "But, man alive, this is America. I think I know a story when I see it. Suppose you were traveling in Germany and should come across a sign over a shop saying, 'Hier wird Deutsch gesprochen.' Wouldn't you think you were dreaming?" Norberg waved an explanatory hand. "This isn't America. This is Milwaukee. After you've lived here a year or so you'll understand what I mean. If we should run a story of that sign, with a 2-column cut, Milwaukee wouldn't even see the joke." But it was not necessary that I live in Milwaukee a year or so in order to understand its peculiarities, for I had a personal conductor and efficient guide in the new friend that had come into my life with the first day of my work on the Post. Surely no woman ever had a stronger friend than little Blackie Griffith, sporting editor of the Milwaukee Post. We became friends, not step by step, but in one gigantic leap such as sometimes triumphs over the gap between acquaintance and liking. I never shall forget my first glimpse of him. He strolled into the city room from his little domicile across the hall. A shabby, disreputable, out-at-elbows office coat was worn over his ultra-smart street clothes, and he was puffing at a freakish little pipe in the shape of a miniature automobile. He eyed me a moment from the doorway, a fantastic, elfin little figure. I thought that I had never seen so strange and so ugly a face as that of this little brown Welshman with his lank, black hair and his deep-set, uncanny black eyes. Suddenly he trotted over to me with a quick little step. In the doorway he had looked 40. Now a smile illumined the many lines of his dark countenance, and in some miraculous way he looked 20. "Are you the New York importation?" he asked, his great black eyes searching my face. "I'm what's left of it," I replied meekly. "I understand you've been in for repairs. Must have met up with something on the road. They say the goin' is full of bumps in New York." "Bumps!" I laughed. "It's uphill, every bit of the road, and yet you've got to go full speed to get anywhere. But I'm running easily again, thank you." He waved away a cloud of pipe smoke and knowingly squinted through the haze. "We don't speed up much here, and they ain't no hill climbin' to speak of. But say, if you ever should hit a nasty place on the route, toot your siren for me and I'll come. I'm a regular little human garage when it comes to patchin' up those aggravatin' screws that need oilin'. And say, don't let Norberg bully you. My name's Blackie. I'm goin' to like you. Come over to my sanctum once in a while and I'll show you my scrapbook and let you play with the office revolver." And so it happened that I had not been in Milwaukee a month before Blackie and I were friends. Norah was horrified. My letters were full of him. I told her that she might get a more complete mental picture of him if she knew that he wore the pinkest shirts and the purplest neckties and the blackest and whitest of black and white checked vests that ever aroused the envy of an office boy, and beneath them all, the gentlest of hearts. And therefore one loves him. There is a sort of spell about the illiterate little slangy brown Welshman. He is a presiding genius of the place. The office boys adore him. The old man takes his advice in selecting a new motor car. The managing editor arranges his lunch hour to suit Blackie's, and they go off to the press club together, arm in arm. It is Blackie who lends a sympathetic ear to the society editor's tale of woe. He hires and fires the office boys. Boldly he criticizes the news editor's make-up. He receives delegations of tan-coated, red-faced, prize-fighting looking persons. He gently explains to the photographer why that last batch of cuts make their subjects look as if afflicted with the German measles. He arbitrates any row that the newspaper may have with such dignitaries as the mayor or the chief of police. He manages boxing shows. He skims about in a smart little roadster. He edits the best sporting page in the city, and at 4 o'clock of an afternoon he likes to send around the corner for a chunk of devil's food cake with butter filling from the Woman's Exchange. Blackie never went to school to speak of. He doesn't know was from were. But he can see a story quicker and farther and clearer than any newspaper man I ever knew, excepting Peter Orme. There is a legend about to the effect that one day the managing editor, who is Scotch and without a sense of humor, ordered that Blackie should henceforth be addressed by his surname of Griffith, as being a more dignified appellation for the use of fellow reporters, hangers-on, copy kids, office boys, and others about the big building. The day after the order was issued the managing editor summoned a freckled youth and thrust a sheaf of galley-proofs into his hand. "Take those to Mr. Griffith," he ordered, without looking up. "To who?" "To Mr. Griffith," said the managing editor, laboriously, and scowling a bit. The boy took 3 unwilling steps toward the door. Then he turned a puzzled face toward the managing editor. "Say, honest, I ain't never heerd of that guy. He must be a new one. Where'll I find him?" "Oh, damn! Take those proofs to Blackie," roared the managing editor. And thus ended Blackie's enforced flight into the realms of dignity. All these things and more I wrote to the scandalized Norah. I informed her that he wore more diamond rings and scarf pins and watch fobs than a railroad conductor, and that his checked top-coat shrieked to heaven. There came back a letter in which every third word was underlined, and which ended by asking what the morals of such a man could be. Then I tried to make Blackie more real to Norah, who, in all her sheltered life, had never come in contact with a man like this. As for his morals, or what you would consider his morals, Sis, they probably are a deep crimson, but I'll swear there is no yellow streak. I never have heard anything more pathetic than his story. Blackie sold papers on a downtown corner when he was a baby 6 years old. Then he got a job as office boy here, and he used to sharpen pencils and run errands and carry copy. After office hours he took care of some horses in an alley barn near by, and after that work was done he was employed about the press room of one of the old German newspaper offices. Sometimes he would be too weary to crawl home after working half the night, and so he would fall asleep, a worn, tragic little figure, on a pile of old papers and sacks in a warm corner near the presses. He was the head of a household, and every penny counted. And all the time he was watching things, and learning. Nothing escaped those keen black eyes. He used to help the photographer when there was a pile of plates to develop, and presently he knew more about photography than the man himself. So they made him staff photographer. In some marvelous way he knew more ball players, and fighters and horsemen than the sporting editor. He had a nose for news that was nothing short of wonderful. He never went out of the office without coming back with a story. They used to use him in the sporting department when a rush was on. Then he became one of the sporting staff. Then assistant sporting editor, then sporting editor. He knows this paper from the basement up. He could operate a linotype or act as managing editor with equal ease. No, I'm afraid that Blackie hasn't had much time for morals. But, Norah, dear, I wish that you could hear him when he talks about his mother. He may follow doubtful paths, and associate with questionable people, and wear restless clothes, but I wouldn't exchange his friendship for that of a dozen of your ordinary so-called good men. All these years of work and suffering have made an old man of little Blackie, although he is young in years. But they haven't spoiled his heart any. He is able to distinguish between sham and truth because he has been obliged to do it ever since he was a child selling papers on the corner. But he still clings to the office that gave him his start, although he makes more money in a single week outside the office than his salary would amount to in half a year. He says that this is a job that does not interfere with his work. Such is Blackie. Surely the oddest friend a woman ever had. He possesses a genius for friendship, and a wonderful understanding of suffering, born of those years of hardship and privation. Each learned the other's story, bit by bit, in a series of confidences exchanged during that peaceful, beatific period that follows just after the last edition has gone down. Blackie's little cubbyhole of an office is always blue with smoke, and cluttered with 1,000 odds and ends, photographs, souvenirs, boxing gloves, a litter of pipes and tobacco, a wardrobe of dust-covered discarded coats and hats, and Blackie in the midst of it all, sunk in the depths of his swivel chair, and looking like an amiable brown gnome, or a cheerful little joss-house god come to life. There is in him an uncanny wisdom which only the streets can teach. He is one of those born newspaper men who could not live out of sight of the ticker-tape, and the copy-hook, and the proof-sheet. "You see, girl, it's like this here," Blackie explained one day. "We're all workin' for some good reason. A few of us are workin' for the glory of it, and most of us are workin' to eat, and lots of us are pluggin' and savin' in the hopes that some day we'll have money enough to get back at some people we know. But there is some few workin' for the pure love of the work, and I guess I'm one of them fools. You see, I started in at this game when I was such a little runt that now it's a ingrowing habit, though it is comfortin' to know you got a place where you can always come in out of the rain, and where you can have your mail sent." "This newspaper work is a curse," I remarked. "Show me a clever newspaper man, and I'll show you a failure. There is nothing in it but the glory, and little of that. We contrive and scheme and run about all day getting a story, and then we write it at fever heat, searching our souls for words that are clean-cut and virile. And then we turn it in, and what is it? What have we to show for our day's work? An ephemeral thing, lacking the first breath of life, a thing that is dead before it is born. Why, any cub reporter, if he were to put into some other profession the same amount of nerve, and tact, and ingenuity and finesse and stick-to-itiveness that he expends in prying a single story out of some unwilling victim, could retire with a fortune in no time." Blackie blew down the stem of his pipe, preparatory to refilling the bowl. There was a quizzical light in his black eyes. The little heap of burned matches at his elbow was growing to kindling-wood proportions. It was common knowledge that Blackie's trick of lighting pipe or cigarette and then forgetting to puff at it caused his bill for matches to exceed his tobacco expense account. "You talk," chuckled Blackie, "like you meant it. But say, girl, it's a lonesome game, this retirin' with a fortune. I've noticed that them guys who retire with a barrel of money usually dies at the end of the first year of a kind of a lingerin' homesickness. You can see their pictures in the papers, with a pathetic story of how they was just beginnin' to enjoy life when along comes the grim reaper and claims 'em." Blackie slid down in his chair and blew a column of smoke ceilingward. "I knew a guy once, newspaper man, too, who retired with a fortune. He used to do the city hall for us. Well, he got in soft with the new administration before election, and made quite a pile in stocks that was tipped off to him by his political friends. His wife was crazy for him to quit the newspaper game. He done it, and say, that guy kept on gettin' richer and richer till even his wife was almost satisfied. But say, girl, was that chap lonesome. One day he come up here lookin' like a dog that's run off with the steak. He was just dyin' for a kind word, and he sniffed the smell of the ink and the hot metal like it was June roses. He kind of wanders over to his old desk and slumps down in the chair and tips it back and puts his feet on the desk, with his hat tipped back and a bum stogie in his mouth. And along came a kid with a bunch of papers wet from the presses and sticks one in his hand and—well, girl, that fellow he just wriggled, he was so happy. You know as well as I do that every man on a morning paper spends his day off hanging around the office wishin' that a mob or a fire or something big would tear loose so he could get back into the game. I guess I told you about the time Von Gerhard sent me abroad, didn't I?" "Von Gerhard?" I repeated, startled. "Do you know him?" "Well, he ain't braggin' about it none," Blackie admitted. "Von Gerhard, he told me I had about 5 years or so to live, about 2-3 years ago. He don't approve of me. Pried into my private life, old Von Gerhard did. Something scandalous. I had sort of went to pieces about that time, and I went to him to be patched up. He thumps me fore and aft, firing a volley of questions, lookin' up the roof of my mouth and squintin' at my fingernails and teeth like I was a prize horse for sale. Then he sits still, lookin' at me for about half a minute, till I begin to feel uncomfortable. Then he says slow, 'Young man, how old are you?' 'Oh, 28 or so,' I says, airy. 'My God!' said he. 'You've crammed twice those years into your life, and you'll have to pay for it. Now you listen to me. You've got to quit workin' and smokin' and get away from this. Take a ocean voyage,' he says, 'and try to get 4 hours sleep a night, anyway.' Well, say, mother she was scared green, so I tucked her under my arm and we hit it up across the ocean. Went to Germany, knowin' that it would feel home-like there, and we took in all the swell Baden, and chased up the Jungfrau. Say, that's a classy little mountain, that Jungfrau. Mother, she had some swell time, I guess. She never set down except for meals, and she wrote picture postals like mad. But say, girl, was I lonesome. Maybe that trip done me good. Anyway, I'm livin' yet. I stuck it out for 4 months, and that ain't so rotten for a guy who just grew up on printer's ink ever since he was old enough to hold a bunch of papers under his arm. Well, one day Mother and me was sittin' out on one of them veranda cafes they run to over there, when somebody hits me a crack on the shoulder, and there stands old Ryan, who used to do A.P. here. He was foreign correspondent for some big New York syndicate papers over there. 'Well, if it ain't Blackie,' he says, 'what in Sam Hill are you doing out of your own cell when Milwaukee's just got 4 more games to win the pennant?' Say, girl, when I got through huggin' him around the neck and buyin' him drinks I knew it was me for the big ship. 'Mother,' I says, 'if you got anybody on your mind that you neglected to send picture postals to, now's your last chance. If I got to die, I'm going out with my scissors in one mitt and my trusty paste pot by my side.' And we hits it up for old Milwaukee. I ain't been away since, except when I was out with the ball team, sending in sportin' extry dope for the pink sheet. The last time I was in at Baumbach's in comes Von Gerhard and—" "Who are Baumbach's?" I interrupted. Blackie regarded me pityingly. "You ain't never been to Baumbach's? Why, girl, if you don't know Baumbach's, you ain't never been properly introduced to Milwaukee. No wonder you ain't hep to the ways of this little community. There ain't what the society editor would call the proper Entente cordial between you and the natives if you haven't had coffee at Baumbach's. It ain't hardly legal to live in Milwaukee all this time without ever having been inside of Stop! If you do not tell me at once just where this wonderful place may be found, and what one does when one finds it, and how I happen to miss it, and why it is so necessary to the proper understanding of the city—" "I'll tell you what I'll do," said Blackie, grinning. "I'll romp you over there to-morrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. Ach Himmel! What will that for a grand time be, no? Blackie, you're a dear to be so polite to an old married creature like me. Did you notice—that is, does Ernst Von Gerhard drop in often at Baumbach's?" End of Chapter 7. Of Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lee Ann Howlett. Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed, by Edna Ferber. Chapter 8. Kaffee and Kaffeekuchen. I have visited Baumbach's. I have heard Milwaukee drinking its afternoon coffee. Oh, Baumbach's, with your deliciously crumbling butter cookies, and your Kaffeekuchen, and your thick cream, and your thicker waitresses, and your cockroaches, and your dinginess, and your dowdy German ladies, and your black, black coffee, where in this country is there another like you? Blackie, true to his promise, had hailed me from the doorway on the afternoon of the following day. In the rush of the day's work I had quite forgotten about Blackie and Baumbach's. "Come, Kindchen," he called, "get your bonnet on. We will by Baumbach's go, no?" Ruefully I gazed at the grimy cuffs of my blouse, and felt of my disheveled hair. "Oh, I'm afraid I can't go. I look so mussy. Haven't had time to brush up." "Brush up!" scoffed Blackie. "The only thing about you that will need brushin' up is your German. I was goin' to warn you to rumple up your hair a little so you wouldn't feel overdressed when you got there. Come on, girl." And so I came. And oh, I'm so glad I came. I must have passed it a dozen times without once noticing it. Just a dingy little black shop nestling between two taller buildings, almost within the shadow of the city hall. Over the sidewalk swung a shabby black sign with gilt letters that spelled Franz Baumbach. Blackie waved an introductory hand in the direction of the sign. "There he is. That's all you'll ever see of him." "Dead?" asked I, regretfully, as we entered the narrow doorway. "No, down in the basement baking Kaffeekuchen." Two tiny show windows faced the street. Such queer old-fashioned windows in these days of plate glass. At the back they were quite open to the shop, and in one of them reposed a huge, white, immovable structure, a majestic, heavy, nutty, surely indigestible birthday cake. Around its edge were flutings and scrolls of white icing, and on its broad breast reposed cherries and stout butterflies of jelly and cunning traceries of colored sugar. It was quite the dressiest cake I had ever beheld. Surely no human hand could be wanton enough to guide a knife through all that magnificence. But in the center of all this splendor was an inscription in heavy white letters of icing: Charlotten's Geburtstag. Reluctantly I tore my gaze from this imposing example of the German confectioner's art, for Blackie was tugging impatiently at my sleeve. "But, Blackie," I marveled, "do you honestly suppose that that structure is intended for some Charlotte's birthday?" "In Milwaukee," explained Blackie, "when you got a birthday you got to have a Geburtstag cake, with your name on it, and all the cousins and aunts and members of the North Side Frauen Turner Verein Gesellschaft in for the day. It ain't considered decent if you don't. Are you ready to fight your way into the main tent?" It was holiday time, and the single narrow aisle of the front shop was crowded. It was not easy to elbow one's way through the packed little space. Men and women were ordering recklessly of the cakes of every description that were heaped in cases and on shelves. Cakes! What a pale, dry name to apply to those crumbling, melting, indigestible German confections. Blackie grinned with enjoyment while I gazed. There were cakes the like of which I had never seen, and of which I did not even know the names. There were little round cup cakes made of almond paste that melts in the mouth. There were Schnecken glazed with a delicious candied brown sugar. There were Bismarcks composed of layer upon layer of flaky crust inlaid with an oozy custard that evades the eager consumer at the first bite, and that slides down one's collar when chased with a pursuing tongue. There were Pfeffernusse. There were Lebkuchen. There were Cheesekuchen, Plumkuchen, Peachkuchen, Apfelkuchen, the juicy fruit stuck thickly into the crust, the whole dusted over with powdered sugar. There were Torten and Hornchen and butter cookies. Blackie touched my arm, and I tore my gaze from a cherry-studded Schaumtorte that was being reverently packed for delivery. "My, what a greedy girl! Now get your mind all made up. This is your chance. You know you're supposed to take a slant at the things and make up your mind what you want before you go back where the tables are. Don't fumble this thing. When Olga or Minna comes waddlin' up to you and says, 'Nu, Fraulein?' you gotta tell her whether your heart says Plumkuchen oder Nusstorte. Or both. See? Just like that. Now make up your mind. I'd hate to have you blunder. Have you decided?" "Decided? How can I?" I moaned, watching a black-haired, black-eyed Alsatian girl behind the counter as she rolled a piece of white paper into a cone, and dipped a spoonful of whipped cream from a great brown bowl heaped high with the snowy stuff. She filled the paper cone, inserted the point of it into one end of a hollow pastry horn, and gently squeezed. Presto! A cream-filled Hornchen. "Oh, Blackie," I gasped. "Come on. I want to go in and eat." As we elbowed our way to the rear room, separated from the front shop only by a flimsy wooden partition, I expected I know not what. But surely this was not Blackie's much vaunted Baumbach's. This long, narrow, dingy room, with its bare floor, and its iron-legged tables whose bare marble tops were yellow with age and use? I said nothing as we seated ourselves. Blackie was watching me out of the tail of his eye. My glance wandered about the shabby, smoke-filled room, and slowly and surely the charm of that fusty, dingy little café came upon me. A huge stove glowed red in one corner. On the wall behind the stove was suspended a wooden rack, black with age, its compartments holding German, Austrian, and Hungarian newspapers. Against the opposite wall stood an ancient walnut mirror, and above it hung a colored print of Bismarck, helmeted, uniformed, and fiercely mustached. The clumsy iron-legged tables stood in two solemn rows down the length of the narrow room. 3 or 4 stout, blond girls plodded back and forth, from tables to front shop, bearing trays of cakes and steaming cups of coffee. There was a rumble and clatter of German. Every one seemed to know every one else. A game of chess was in progress at one table, and between moves each contestant would refresh himself with a long-drawn, sibilant mouthful of coffee. There was nothing about the place, or its occupants, to remind one of America. This dim, smoky, cake-scented café was Germany. "Time," said Blackie. "Here comes Rosie to take our order. You can take your choice of coffee or chocolate. That's as fancy as they get here." An expansive blond girl paused at our table, smiling a broad welcome at Blackie. "Wie geht's, Roschen?" he greeted her. Roschen's smile became still more pervasive, so that her blue eyes disappeared in creases of good humor. She wiped the marble table top with a large and careless gesture that precipitated stray crumbs into our laps. "Gut," murmured she, coyly, and leaned one hand on a portly hip in an attitude of waiting. "Coffee?" asked Blackie, turning to me. I nodded. "Zweimal Kaffee?" beamed Roschen, grasping the idea. "Now's your time to speak up," urged Blackie. "Go ahead and order all the cream gefilte things that look good to you out in front." But I leaned forward, lowering my voice discreetly. "Blackie, before I plunge in too recklessly, tell me, are their prices very—" "Sa-a-ay, child, you just can't spend half a dollar here if you try. The flossiest kind of thing they got is only 10 cents a order. They'll smother you in whipped cream for a quarter. You can come in here and eat and put away piles of cakes till you feel like a combination of little Jack Horner and old Doc Johnson. And when you're all through, they hand you your check and, say it says 45 cents, you can't beat it, so wade right in and spoil your complexion." With enthusiasm I turned upon the patient Rosie. "Oh, bring me some of those cunning little round things with the cream on 'em, you know, 2 of those, eh, Blackie? And a couple of those with the flaky crust and the custard between, and a slice of that fluffy-looking cake, and some of those funny cocked hat-shaped cookies." But a pall of bewilderment was slowly settling over Rosie's erstwhile smiling face. Her plump shoulders went up in a helpless shrug, and she turned her round blue eyes appealingly to Blackie. "Was meint Sie alles?" she asked. So I began all over again, with the assistance of Blackie. We went into minute detail. We made elaborate gestures. We drew pictures of our desired goodies on the marble-topped table using a soft lead pencil. Rosie's countenance wore a distracted look. In desperation I was about to accompany her to the crowded shop, there to point out my chosen dainties, when suddenly, as they would put it here, a light went over her. "Ach, yes! Sie wollten vielleicht Gaberguter Gugelhof haben, und auch Schamtort und Bismarcks und Hornchen mit Creme gefüllt, nicht?" "Certainly," I murmured, quite crushed. Roschen waddled merrily off to the shop. Blackie was rolling a cigarette. He ran his funny little red tongue along the edge of the paper and glanced up at me in glee. "Don't bother about me," he generously observed. "Just set still and let the atmosphere soak in." But already I was lost in contemplation of a red-faced, pompadoured German who was drinking coffee and reading the Feigenblätter at a table just across the way. There were counterparts of my aborigines at Knapf's, thick-spectacled engineers with high foreheads, actors and actresses from the German Stock Company, reporters from the English and German newspapers, business men with comfortable German consciences, long-haired musicians, dapper young lawyers, a giggling group of college girls and boys, a couple of smartly dressed women nibbling appreciatively at slices of Nusstorte, low-voiced lovers whose coffee cups stood untouched at their elbows, while no fragrant cloud of steam rose to indicate that there was warmth within. Their glances grow warmer as the neglected coffee grows colder. The color comes and goes in the girl's face, and I watch it, a bit enviously, marveling that the old story still should be so new. At a large square table near the doorway a group of 8 men were absorbed in an animated political discussion, accompanied by much waving of arms and thundering of gutturals. It appeared to be a table of importance, for the high-backed bench that ran along one side was upholstered in worn red velvet, and every newcomer paused a moment to nod or to say a word in greeting. It was not of American politics that they talked, but of the politics of Austria and Hungary. Finally the argument resolved itself into a duel of words between a handsome, red-faced German, whose rosy skin seemed to take on a deeper tone in contrast to the whiteness of his hair and mustache, and the swarthy young fellow whose thick spectacles and heavy mane of black hair gave him the look of a caricature out of an illustrated German weekly. The red-faced man argued loudly, with much rapping of bare knuckles on the table-top. But the dark man spoke seldom, and softly, with a little twisted half-smile on his lips, and whenever he spoke the red-faced man grew redder, and there came a huge laugh from the others who sat listening. "Say, wouldn't it curdle your English?" Blackie laughed. Solemnly I turned to him. "Blackie Griffith, these people do not even realize that there is anything unusual about this." "Sure not. That's the beauty of it. They don't need to make no artificial atmosphere for this place. It just grows wild like dandelions. Everybody comes here for their coffee because their aunts and uncles and Grossmutters and Grosspapas used to come, and come yet, if they're livin'. And after all, what is it but a little German bakery?" "But oh, wise Herr Baumbach down in the kitchen! Oh, subtle Frau Baumbach back of the desk," said I. "Others may fit their shops with mirrors and cut-glass chandeliers and oriental rugs and mahogany, but you sit serenely by, and you smile, and you change nothing. You let the brown walls grow dimmer with age, you see the marble-topped tables turning yellow, you leave bare your wooden floor, and you smile and smile and smile." "Fine!" applauded Blackie. "You're on. And here comes Rosie." Rosie, the radiant, placed on the table cups and saucers of an unbelievable thickness. She set them down on the marble surface with a crash, as one who knows well that no mere marble or granite could shatter the solidity of those stout earthenware receptacles. Napkins there were none. I was to learn that fingers were rid of any clinging remnants of cream or crumb by the simple expedient of licking them. Blackie emptied his pitcher of cream into his cup of black, black coffee, sugared it, stirred, tasted, and then, with a wicked gleam in his black eyes, he lifted the heavy cup to his lips and took a long, gurgling mouthful. "Blackie," I hissed, "if you do that again I shall refuse to speak to you." "Do what?" demanded he, all injured innocence. "Snuffle up your coffee like that." "Why, girl, that's the proper way to drink coffee here. Listen to everybody else." And while I glared he wrapped his hand lovingly about his cup, holding the spoon imprisoned between first and second fingers, and took another sibilant mouthful. "Any more of your back talk and I'll drink it out of my saucer and blow on it like the hefty party over there in the earrings is doin'. Calm yourself and try a Bismarck." I picked up one of the flaky confections and eyed it in despair. There were no plates except that on which the cakes reposed. "How does one eat them?" I inquired. "You don't really eat 'em. The motion is more like inhalin'. To eat 'em successful you really ought to get into a bathtub half filled with water, because as soon's you bite in at one end, why, the custard stuff slides out at the other, and no human mouth can be two places at oncet. Shut your eyes, girl, and just wade in." I waited. In silence I took a deep, delicious bite, nimbly chasing the coy filling around a corner with my tongue, devoured every bit down to the last crumb, and licked the stickiness off my fingers. Then I investigated the interior of the next cake. "I'm coming here every day," I announced. "Better not. Ruin your complexion and turn all your lines into bumps. Look at the dame with the earrings. I've been keepin' count and I've seen her eat 3 Schnecken, 2 cream puffs, a Nusshornchen, and a slice of torte with 2 cups of coffee. Ain't she a horrible example? And yet she's got the nerve to wear a princess gown." "I don't care," I replied recklessly, my voice choked with whipped cream and butteriness. "I can just feel myself getting greasy. Haven't I done beautifully for a new hand? Now tell me about some of these people. Who is the funny little man in the check suit, with the black braid trimming and the green cravat, and the white spats, and the tan hat and the eyeglasses?" "Ain't them the dizzy habiliments?" A note of envy crept into Blackie's voice. "His name is Hugo Luders. Used to be a reporter on the Germania, but he's reformed and gone into advertisin', where there's real money. Some say he wears them clothes on a bet, and some say his taste in dress is a curse descended upon him from Joseph, the guy with the fancy coat, but I think he wears 'em because he fancies 'em. He's been coming here every afternoon for 12 years, has a cup of coffee, game of chess, and a powwow with a bunch of cronies. If Baumbachs ever decide to paint the front of their shop, or put in cut-glass fixtures and hand-painted china, Hugo Luders would serve an injunction on 'em. Next." "Who's the woman with the leathery complexion, and the belt to match, and the untidy hair and the big feet? I like her face. And why does she sit at a table with all those strange-looking men? And who are all the men? And who is the fur-lined grand opera tenor just coming in? Oh!" Blackie glanced over his shoulder just as the tall man in the doorway turned his face toward us. "That? Why, girl, that's Von Gerhard, the man who gives me one more year to live. Look at everybody kowtowing to him. He don't favor Baumbachs often. Too busy patching up the nervous wrecks that are washed up on his shores." The tall figure in the doorway was glancing from table to table, nodding here and there to an acquaintance. His eyes traveled the length of the room. Now they were nearing us. I felt a sudden inexplicable tightening at heart and throat, as though fingers were clutching there. Then his eyes met mine, and I felt the blood rushing to my face as he came swiftly over to our table and took my hand in his. "So you have discovered Baumbachs," he said. "May I have my coffee and cigar here with you?" Blackie here is responsible for my being initiated into the sticky mysteries of Baumbachs. I never should have discovered it if he had not offered to act as personal conductor. You know one another, I believe?" The two men shook hands across the table. There was something forced and graceless about the act. Blackie eyed Von Gerhard through a misty curtain of cigarette smoke. Von Gerhard gazed at Blackie through narrowed lids as he lighted his cigar. "I'm the gink you killed off 2 or 3 years back," Blackie explained. "I remember you perfectly," Von Gerhard returned, courteously. "I rejoice to see that I was mistaken." "Well," drawled Blackie, a wicked gleam in his black eyes, "I'm some rejoiced myself, old top. Angel wings and a white kimono, worn barefooty, would go some rotten with my Spanish style of beauty, what? Didn't know that you and Madame friend here was acquainted. Known each other long?" I felt myself flushing again. "I knew Dr. Von Gerhard back home. I've scarcely seen him since I have been here. Famous specialists can't be bothered with middle-aged relatives of their college friends, can they, Herr Doctor?" And now it was Von Gerhard's face that flushed a deep and painful crimson. He looked at me, in silence, and I felt very little, and insignificant, and much like an impudent child who has stuck out its tongue at its elders. Silent men always affect talkative women in that way. "You know that what you say is not true," he said slowly. "Well, we won't quibble. We were just about to leave, weren't we, Blackie?" "Just," said Blackie, rising. "Sorry to see you drinking Baumbach's coffee, Doc. It ain't fair to your patients." "Quite right," replied Von Gerhard, and rose with us. "I shall not drink it. I shall walk home with Mrs. Orme instead, if she will allow me. That will be more stimulating than coffee, and twice as dangerous, perhaps, but—" "You know how I hate that sort of thing," I said coldly, as we passed from the warmth of the little front shop where the plump girls were still filling pasteboard boxes with holiday cakes, to the brisk chill of the winter street. The little black and gilt sign swung and creaked in the wind. Whimsically, and with the memory of that last cream-filled cake fresh in my mind, I saluted the letters that spelled Franz Baumbach. Blackie chuckled impishly. "Just the same, try a pinch of soda bicarbonate when you get home, Dawn," he advised. "Well, I'm off to the factory again. Got to make up for time wasted on my lady friend. Auf Wiedersehen!" And the little figure in the check top coat trotted off. "But he called you Dawn," broke from Von Gerhard. "Mm-hm," I agreed. "My name's Dawn." "Surely not to him. You have known him but a few weeks. I would not have presumed—" "Blackie never presumes," I laughed. "Blackie's just Blackie. Imagine taking offense at him. He knows every one by their given name, from Joe, the boss of the press room, to the chief, who imports his office coats from London. Besides, Blackie and I are newspaper men, and people don't scrape and bow in a newspaper office, especially when they're fond of one another. You wouldn't understand." As I looked at Von Gerhard in the light of the street lamp I saw a tense, drawn look about the little group of muscles which show when the teeth are set hard. When he spoke those muscles had relaxed but little. "One man does not talk ill of another. But this is different. I want to ask you, do you know what manner of man this Blackie is? I ask you because I would have you safe and sheltered always from such as he. Because I—" "Safe? From Blackie? Now listen. There never was a safer, saner, truer, more generous friend. Oh, I know what his life has been. But what else could it have been, beginning as he did? I have no wish to reform him. I tried my hand at reforming one man and made a glorious mess of it. So I'll just take Blackie as he is, if you please. Slang, wickedness, pink shirt, red necktie, diamond rings and all. If there's any bad in him, we all know it, for it's right down on the table, face up. You're just angry because he called you Doc." "Small one," said Von Gerhard, in his quaint German idiom. "We will not quarrel, you and I. If I have been neglectful, it was because edged tools were never a chosen plaything of mine. Perhaps your little Blackie realizes that he need have no fear of such things, for the Great Fear is upon him." "The Great Fear? You mean—" "I mean that there are too many fine little lines radiating from the corners of the sunken eyes, and that his hand clasp leaves a moisture in the palm. Ach, you may laugh. Come, we will change the subject to something more cheerful, yes? Tell me, how grows the book?" "By inches. After working all day on a bulletin paper whose city editor is constantly shouting, 'Boil it now, fellows! Keep it down! We're crowded!' it is too much of a wrench to find myself seated calmly before my own typewriter at night, privileged to write 100,000 words if I choose. I can't get over the habit of crowding the story all into the first paragraph. Whenever I flower into a descriptive passage I glance nervously over my shoulder, expecting to find Norberg stationed behind me, scissors and blue pencil in hand. Consequently the book, thus far, sounds very much like a police reporter's story of a fire 4 minutes before the paper is due to go to press." Von Gerhard's face was unsmiling. "So," he said slowly, "you burn the candle at both ends. All day you write, is it not so? And at night you come home to write still more? Ach, Kindchen! Na, we shall change all that. We will be better comrades, we two, yes? You remember that gay little walk of last autumn when we explored the Michigan country lane at dusk? I shall be your Sunday Schatz, and there shall be more rambles like that one, to bring the roses into your cheeks. We shall be good Kameraden, as you and this little Griffith are. What is it they say? Good fellows. That is it. Good fellows, yes? So, shall we shake hands on it?" But I snatched my hand away. "I don't want to be a good fellow," I cried. "I'm tired of being a good fellow. I've been a good fellow for years and years, while every other married woman in the world has been happy in her own home, bringing up her babies. When I am old I want some sons to worry me, too, and to stay awake nights for, and some daughters to keep me young, and to prevent me from doing my hair in a knob and wearing bonnets. I hate good fellow women, and so do you, and so does every one else. I—" "Dawn!" cried Von Gerhard. But I ran up the steps and into the house, and slammed the door behind me, leaving him standing there. Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Dawn O'Hara, the Girl Who Laughed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lee Ann Howlett. Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed, by Edna Ferber. Chapter 9. The Lady from Vienna. 2 more aborigines have appeared. One of them is a lady aborigine. They made their entrance at supper, and I forgot to eat, watching them. The newcomers are from Vienna. He is an expert engineer, and she is a woman of noble birth, with a history. Their combined appearance is calculated to strike terror to the heart. He is daringly ugly, with a chin that curves in under his lip and then out in a peak, like pictures of Punch. She wore a gray gown of a style I never had seen before, and never expect to see again. It was fastened with huge black buttons all the way down the breathlessly tight front, and the upper part was composed of that prehistoric garment known as a basque. She curved in where she should have curved out, and she bulged where she should have had lines. About her neck was suspended a string of cannon ball beads that clanked as she walked. On her forehead rested a sparse fringe. Mein Himmel, thought I, am I dreaming? This isn't Wisconsin. This is Nurnberg or Strasbourg, with a dash of Heidelberg and Berlin thrown in. Dawn, old girl, it's going to be more instructive than a cook's tour. That turned out to be the truest prophecy I ever made. The first surprising thing that the newcomers did was to seat themselves at the long table with the other aborigines, the lady aborigine being the only woman among the 12 men. It was plain that they had known one another previous to this meeting, for they became very good friends at once, and the men grew heavily humorous about there being 13 at table. At that the lady aborigine began to laugh. Straightway I forgot the outlandish gown, forgot the cannonball beads, forgot the sparse fringe, forgave the absence of lines. Such a voice! A lilting, melodious thing. She broke into a torrent of speech, with bewildering gestures, and I saw that her hands were exquisitely formed and as expressive as her voice. Her German was the musical tongue of the Viennese, possessing none of the gutturals and sputterings. When she crowned it with the gay little trilling laugh, my views on the language underwent a lightning change. It seemed the most natural thing in the world to see her open the flat silver case that dangled at the end of the cannonball chain, take out a cigarette, light it, and smoke it there in that little German dining room. She wore the most gracefully nonchalant air imaginable as she blew little rings and wreaths, and laughed and chatted brightly with her husband and the other men. Occasionally she broke into French, her accent as charmingly perfect as it had been in her native tongue. There was a moment of breathless staring on the part of the respectable middle-class Frauen at the other tables. Then they shrugged their shoulders and plunged into their meal again. There was a certain little high-born air of assurance about that cigarette smoking that no amount of staring could ruffle. Watching the new aborigines grew to be a sort of game. The lady aborigine of the golden voice and the ugly husband of the peaked chin had a strange fascination for me. I scrambled downstairs at mealtime in order not to miss them, and I dawdled over the meal so that I need not leave before they. I discovered that when the lady aborigine was animated, her face was that of a young woman, possessing a certain high-bred charm, but that when in repose, the face of the lady aborigine was that of a very old and tired woman indeed. Also that her husband bullied her, and that when he did that she looked at him worshipingly. Then one evening, a week or so after the appearance of the new aborigines, there came a clumping at my door. I was seated at my typewriter and the book was balkier than usual, and I wished that the clumper at the door would go away. "Come," I called, ungraciously enough. Then on second thought, "Herein." The knob turned slowly, and the door opened just enough to admit the top of a head crowned with a tight, moist German knob of hair. I searched my memory to recognize the knob, failed utterly, and said again, this time with mingled curiosity and hospitality, "Won't you come in?" The apparently bodiless head thrust itself forward a bit, disclosing an apologetically smiling face, with high cheek-bones that glistened with friendliness and scrubbing. "Nabend, Fraulein," said the head. "Nabend," I replied, more mystified than ever. "Howdy-do. Is there anything—" The head thrust itself forward still more, showing a pair of plump shoulders as its support. Then the plump shoulders heaved into the room, disclosing a stout, starched gingham body. "Ich bin Frau Knopf," announced the beaming vision. Now up to this time Frau Knopf had maintained a Mrs. Harris-like mysteriousness. I had heard rumors of her, and I had partaken of certain crispy dishes of German extraction reported to have come from her deft hands, but I had not even caught a glimpse of her skirts whisking around a corner. Therefore, "Frau Knopf," I repeated. "Nonsense. There ain't no sich person. That is, I'm glad to see you. Won't you come in and sit down?" "Ach, no," smiled the substantial Frau Knopf, clinging tightly to the doorknob. "I got no time. It gives much to do tonight yet. Koukin dough I must set, und ich weiß nicht was. I got no time." Bustling, red-cheeked Frau Knopf! This was why I had never had a glimpse of her. Always she got no time. For while Herr Knopf, dapper and genial, welcomed newcomers, chatted with the diners, poured a glass of foaming Doppelbrau for Herr Weber or dexterously carved fowl for the aborigines' table, Frau Knopf was making the wheels go round. I discovered that it was she who bakes the melting, golden German Pfannkuchen on Sunday mornings. She it is who fries the crisp and hissing Wiener Schnitzel, She it is who prepares the plump ducklings, and the thick gravies, and the steaming lentil soup, and the rosy sausages nestling coyly in their bed of sauerkraut. All the week Frau Knapf bakes and broils and stews, her rosy cheeks taking on a twinkling crimson from the fire over which she bends. But on Sunday night Frau Knapf sheds her huge apron and rolls down the sleeves from her plump arms. On Sunday evening she leaves pots and pans and cooking, and is a transformed Frau Knapf. Then does she don a bright blue silk waist and a velvet coat that is dripping with jet, and a black bonnet on which are perched palpitating birds and weary-looking plumes. Then she and Herr Knapf walk comfortably down to the Pabst Theater to see the German play by the German Stock Company. They applaud their favorite stout blonde German comedian as she romps through the acts of a sprightly German comedy, and after the play they go to their favorite Weinstube around the corner. There they have sardellen and cheese sandwiches and a great deal of beer, and for one charmed evening Frau Knapf forgets all about the insides of geese and the thickening for gravies, and is happy. Many of these things Frau Knapf herself told me, standing there by the door with the Koukin heavy on her mind. Some of them I got from Ernst Von Gerhard when I told him about my visitor and her errand. The errand was not disclosed until Frau Knapf had caught me casting a despairing glance at my last typewritten page. "Ach, see, you got no time for talking too, ain't it?" she apologized. "Heaps of time," I politely assured her. "Don't hurry. But why not have a chair and be comfortable?" Frau Knapf was not to be deceived. "I go in a minute. But first it is something I like to ask you. You know maybe Frau Nirlanger?" I shook my head. "But sure you must know. From Vienna she is, with such a voice like a bird." "And the beads, and the gray gown, and the fringe, and the cigarettes?" "And the oogly husband," finished Frau Knapf, nodding. "Oogly," I agreed, "isn't the name for it." "And so she is Frau Nirlanger? I thought there would be a Von at the very least." Whereupon my visitor deserted the doorknob, took half a dozen stealthy steps in my direction, and lowered her voice to a hissing whisper of confidence. "It is more as a Von. I will tell you. Today comes Frau Nirlanger by me, and she says, 'Frau Knapf, I wish to buy clothes, aber echt Amerikanisch.' Myself I do not know what is modish, and I cannot go alone to buy." "That's a grand idea," said I, recalling the gray basque and the cannonball beads. "Ja, sure it is," agreed Frau Knapf. "So, she asked me was it some lady who would come with her by the stores to help a hat and suit and dresses to buy. Stylish she likes they should be, and echt Amerikanisch. So, I say to her, I would go myself with you, only so awful stylish I ain't, and anyway I got no time. But a lady I know who has got such stylish clothes." Frau Knapf raised admiring hands and eyes toward heaven. "Such a nice lady she is, and stylish, like anything. And her name is Frau Orme." "Oh, really, Frau Knapf," I murmured in blushing confusion. "Sure, it is so," insisted Frau Knapf, coming a step nearer, and sinking, her voice one hiss lower. "You shouldn't say I said it, but Frau Nirlanger likes she should look young for her husband. He is much younger as she is, obermuch. Anyhow, 10 years. Frau Nirlanger does not tell me this, but from other people I have found out." Frau Knapf shook her head mysteriously a great many times. "But maybe you ain't got such an interest in Frau Nirlanger, yes?" "Interest? I'm eaten up with curiosity. You shan't leave this room alive until you've told me." Frau Knapf shook with silent mirth. "Now you make jokings, ain't? Well, I tell you. In Vienna, Frau Nirlanger was a widow, from a family, aber auch Hodel, very high born. From the court her family is, and friends from the Emperor, and alles. Sure, Frau Nirlanger, she is different from the rest. Books she likes, und meetings, und all such komisch things, and what you think?" "I don't know," I gasped, hanging on her words. "What do I think?" "She meets this here Konrad Nirlanger and falls with him in love, und her family is mad. But schrecklich mad. 40 years old she is, and from a noble family, and Konrad Nirlanger is only a student from a university, and he comes from the Volk. Sehr gebildet he is, but not high born. So, she runs with him away and is married." Shamelessly I drank it all in. "You don't mean it! Well, then what happened? She ran away with him, with that chin, and then what?" Frau Knapf was enjoying it as much as I. She drew a long breath, felt of the knob of hair, and plunged once more into the story. "Like a story book it is, nicht? Well, Frau Nirlanger, she has already a boy who is 10 years old, and a fine sum of money that her first husband left her. Aber when she runs with this poor girl away from her family, and her first husband's family is so schrecklich mad that they try by law to take from her boy and her money, because she has her high-born family disgraced, you see? For a year they fight in the courts, and then it stands that her money Frau Nirlanger can keep, but her boy she cannot have. He will be taken by her high-born family and educated, and he must forget all about his mamma. To cry it is, ain't it? Das arm Kind. Well, she can stand it no longer to live where her boy is and not to see him. So Konrad Nirlanger, he gets a chance to come by America, where there is a big engineering plant here in Milwaukee, and she begs her husband he should come, because this boy she loves very much. Oh, she loves her young husband, too, but different, yes? Oh, yes, I agreed, remembering the gay little trilling laugh, and the face that was so young when animated, and so old and worn in repose. Oh, yes, quite different. Frau Knapf smoothed her spotless skirt and shook her head slowly and sadly. So, by America they come. And Konrad Nirlanger, he is maybe a little cross and so, because for a year they have been in the courts, and it might have been the money they would lose, and for money Konrad Nirlanger cares. Well, you shall see. But Frau Nirlanger must not mourn and cry. She must laugh and sing and be gay for her husband. But Frau Nirlanger has no grand clothes, for first she runs away with Konrad Nirlanger, and then her money is tied in the law. Now she has again her money, and she must be young. But young! With a gesture that expressed a world of pathos and futility, Frau Knapf flung out her arms. He must not see that she looks different as the ladies in this country. So Frau Nirlanger wants she should buy here in the stores new dresses, echt Amerikanisch. All new and beautiful things she would have, because she must look young, ain't it? And perhaps her boy will remember her when he is a fine young man, if she is yet young when he grows up, you see. And, too, there is the young husband. First she gives up her old life, and her friends and her family for this man, and then she must do all things to keep him. Men, they are but children, after all, spake the wise Frau Knapf in conclusion. They war and cry and plead for that which they would have, and when they have won, then see, they are amused for a moment, and the new toy is thrown aside. Poor, plain, vivacious, fascinating little Frau Nirlanger, I said. I wonder just how much of pain and heartache that little musical laugh of hers conceals. Ja, that is so, mused Frau Knapf. Her eyes look like eyes that have wept much, not? And so, you will be so kind and go maybe to select the so beautiful clothes? Clothes? I repeated, remembering the original errand. But, dear lady, how does one select clothes for a woman of 40 who would not weary her husband? That is a task for a French modiste, a wizard, and a fairy godmother all rolled into one. But you will do it, yes? Urged Frau Knapf. I'll do it, I agreed a bit ruefully, if only to see the face of the oogly husband when his bride is properly corseted and shod. Whereupon Frau Knapf, in a panic, remembered the unset Koukin dough and rushed away, with her hand on her lips and her eyes big with secrecy. And I sat staring at the last typewritten page stuck in my typewriter, and I found that the little letters on the white page were swimming in a dim purple haze. End of Chapter 9. Of Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lee Ann Howlett. Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed, by Edna Ferber. Chapter 10. A Tragedy of Gowns. From husbands in general, and from oogly German husbands in particular, may Hymen defend me. Never again will I attempt to select echt Amerikanisch clothes for a woman who must not weary her young husband. But how was I to know that the harmless little shopping expedition would resolve itself into a domestic tragedy, with Herr Nirlanger as the villain, Frau Nirlanger as the persecuted heroine, and I as— what is it in tragedy that corresponds to the innocent bystander in real life? That would be my role. The purchasing of the clothes was a real joy. Next to buying pretty things for myself, there is nothing I like better than choosing them for someone else. And when that someone else happens to be a fascinating little foreigner, who coos over the silken stuffs in a delightful mixture of German and English, and especially when that someone else must be made to look so charming that she will astonish her oogly husband, Then does the selecting of those pretty things cease to be a task, and become an art. It was to be a complete surprise to Herr Nirlanger. He was to know nothing of it until everything was finished, and Frau Nirlanger, dressed in the prettiest of the pretty Amerikanisch gowns, was ready to astound him when he should come home from the office of the vast plant where he solved engineering problems. "From my own money I buy all this," Frau Nirlanger confided to me with a gay little laugh of excitement, as we started out. "From Vienna it comes. Always I have given it at once to my husband, as a wife should. Yesterday it came, but I said nothing, and when my husband said to me, 'Anna, did not the money come as usual today? It is time,' I told a little lie, but a little one, is it not? Very amusing it was. Almost I did laugh. Na, he will not be cross when he see how his wife like the Amerikanisch ladies will look. He admires very much the ladies of America. Many times he has said so." "I'll wager he has, the great ugly boor," I thought, in parenthesis. "We'll show him," I said aloud. "He won't know you. Such a lot of beautiful clothes as we can buy with all this money. Oh, dear Frau Nirlanger, it's going to be slathers of fun. I feel as excited about it as though it were a trousseau we were buying." "So it is," she replied, a little shadow of sadness falling across the brightness of her face. "I had no proper clothes when we were married, but nothing. You know, perhaps, my story. In America everyone knows everything. It is wonderful. When I ran away to marry Konrad Nirlanger I had only the dress which I wore. Even that I borrowed from one of the upper servants, on a pretext, so that no one should recognize me. Ach Gott! I need not have worried. So. You see, it will be after all a trousseau." Why, oh why, should a woman with her graceful carriage and pretty vivacity have been cursed with such an ill-assorted lot of features? Especially when certain boorish young husbands have expressed an admiration for pink and white effects and femininity. "Never mind, Mr. Husband, I'll show yez," I resolved as the elevator left us at the floor where waxen ladies in shining glass cases smiled amiably all the day. There must be no violent pinks or blues. Brown was too old. She was not young enough for black. Violet was too trying. And so the gowns began to strew tables and chairs and racks, and still I shook my head, and Frau Nirlanger looked despairing, and the bepuffed and real Irish crocheted saleswoman began to develop a baleful gleam about the eyes. And then we found it. It was a case of love at first sight. The unimaginative would have called it gray. The thoughtless would have pronounced it pink. It was neither and both. A soft, rosily gray mixture of the two, like the sky that one sometimes sees at winter twilight, the pink of the sunset veiled by the gray of the snow clouds. It was of a supple, shining cloth, simple in cut, graceful in lines. There! We've found it. Let's pray that it will not require too much altering. But when it had been slipped over her head we groaned at the inadequacy of her old-fashioned stays. There followed a flying visit to the department where hips were whisked out of sight in a jiffy, and where lines miraculously took the place of curves. Then came the gown once more, over the new stays this time. The effect was magical. The Irish crocheted saleswoman and I clasped hands and fell back in attitudes of admiration. Frau Nirlanger turned this way and that before the long mirror and chattered like a pleased child. Her adjectives grew into words of 6 syllables. She cooed over the soft shining stuff in little broken exclamations in French and German. Then came a straight and simple street suit of blue cloth, a lingerie gown of white, hats, shoes, and even a couple of limp satin petticoats. The day was gone before we could finish. I bullied them into promising the pinky gray gown for the next afternoon. "Such funs!" giggled Frau Nirlanger. "And how it makes one tired! So kind you were to take this trouble for me. Me, I could never have warred with that Fraulein who served us. So haughty she was, nicht? But it is good again pretty clothes to have. Pretty gowns I lofe. You also, not?" "Indeed, I do lofe 'em, but my money comes to me in a yellow pay envelope, and it is spent before it reaches me, as a rule. It doesn't leave much of a margin for general recklessness." A tiny sigh came from Frau Nirlanger. "There will be little to give to Konrad this time. So much money they cost, those clothes. But Konrad, he will not care when he sees the so beautiful dresses. Is it not so?" "Care!" I cried with a great deal of bravado, although a tiny inner voice spake in doubt. Certainly not. How could he? Next day the boxes came, and we smuggled them into my room. The unwrapping of the tissue paper folds was a ceremony. We reveled in the very crackle of it. I had scuttled home from the office as early as decency would permit, in order to have plenty of time for the dressing. It must be quite finished before Herr Nirlanger should arrive. Frau Nirlanger had purchased 3 tickets for the German theater, also as a surprise, and I was to accompany the happily surprised husband and the proud little wife of the new Amerikanische clothes. I coaxed her to let me do things to her hair. Usually she wore a stiff and ugly coiffure that could only be described as a chignon. I do not recollect ever having seen a chignon, but I know that it must look like that. I was thankful for my Irish deftness of fingers as I stepped back to view the result of my labors. The new arrangement of the hair gave her features a new softness and dignity. We came to the lacing of the stays, with their exaggerated length. "Aber!" exclaimed Frau Nirlanger, not daring to laugh because of the strange snugness. "Ach, and again, aber to laugh it is!" We had decided the prettiest of the new gowns must do honor to the occasion. "This shade is called Ashes of Roses," I explained, as I slipped it over her head. "Ashes of roses!" she echoed. "How pretty, yes? But a little sad, too, is it not so? Like rosy hopes that have been withered. Ach, what a foolish talk! So now you will fasten it, please. A real trick it is to button such a dress. So sly they are, those fastenings." When all the sly fastenings were secure, I stood at gaze. "Nose is shiny," I announced, searching in a drawer for chamois and powder. Frau Nirlanger raised an objecting hand. "But Konrad does not approve of such things. He has said so. He has—" "You tell your Konrad that a chamois skin isn't half as objectionable as a shiny one. Come here and let me dust this over your nose and chin, while I breathe a prayer of thanks that I have no overzealous husband near to forbid me the use of a bit of powder. There, if I says it meself as shouldn't, ye's are a credit to me, me darlint." "You are satisfied? There is not one small thing awry? Ach, how we shall laugh at Konrad's face." "Satisfied? I'd kiss you if I weren't afraid that I should muss you up. You're not the same woman. You look like a girl, and so pretty. Now skedaddle into your own rooms, but don't you dare to sit down for a moment. I'm going down to get Frau Knapf before your husband arrives." "But is there then time?" inquired Frau Nirlanger. "He should be here now." "I'll bring her up in a jiffy, just for one peep. She won't know you. Her face will be a treat. Don't touch your hair, it's quite perfect. And for John's sake, don't twist around to look at yourself in the back or something will burst. I know it will. I'll be back in a minute. Now run." The slender, graceful figure disappeared with a gay little laugh, and I flew downstairs for Frau Knapf. She was discovered with a spoon in one hand and a spluttering saucepan in the other. I detached her from them, clasped her big, capable red hands, and dragged her up the stairs, explaining as I went. "Now don't fuss about that supper. Let 'em wait. You must see her before Herr Nirlanger comes home. He's due any minute. She looks like a girl. So young. And actually pretty. And her figure. Divine. Funny what a difference a decent pair of corsets and a gown and some puffs will make, hm?" Frau Knapf was panting as I pulled her after me in swift eagerness. Between puffs she brought out exclamations of surprise and unbelief, such as, "Unmöglich!" Puff, puff. "Aber wunderbar!" Puff, puff. We stopped before Frau Nirlanger's door. I struck a dramatic pose. "Prepare!" I cried grandly, and threw open the door with a bang. Crouched against the wall at a far corner of the room was Frau Nirlanger. Her hands were clasped over her breast, and her eyes were dilated as though she had been running. In the center of the room stood Konrad Nirlanger, and on his oogly face was the very oogliest look that I have ever seen on a man. He glanced at us as we stood transfixed in the doorway, and laughed a short, sneering laugh that was like a stinging blow on the cheek. "So!" he said, and I would not have believed that men really said "so" in that way outside of a melodrama. "So! You're in the little surprise, yes? You carry your meddling outside of your newspaper work, eh? I leave behind me an old wife in the morning, and in the evening, presto! I find a young bride. Wonderful, but wonderful." He laughed an unmusical and mirthless laugh. "But don't you like it?" I asked, like a simpleton. Frau Nirlanger seemed to shrink before our very eyes, so that the pretty gown hung in limp folds about her. I stared, fascinated, at Konrad Nirlanger's cruel face with its little eyes that were too close together, and its chin that curved in below the mouth and out again so grotesquely. "Like it!" sneered Konrad Nirlanger. "For a young girl, yes. But how useless this belated trousseau. What a waste of good money. For see, a young wife I do not want. Young women one can have in plenty, always. But I have an old woman married, and for an old woman the gowns need be few, eh, Frau Orme? And you too, Frau Knapf?" Frau Knapf, crimson and staring, was dumb. There came a little shivering moan from the figure crouched in the corner, and Frau Nirlanger, her face queerly withered and ashen, crumpled slowly in a little heap on the floor and buried her shamed head in her arms. Konrad Nirlanger turned to his wife, the black look on his face growing blacker. "Come, get up, Anna," he ordered in German. "These heroics become not a woman of your years. And, too, you must not ruin the so costly gown that will be returned to-morrow." Frau Nirlanger's white face was lifted from the shelter of her arms. The stricken look was still upon it, but there was no cowering in her attitude now. Slowly she rose to her feet. I had not realized that she was so tall. "The gown does not go back," she said. "So?" he snarled, with a savage note in his voice. "Now hear me. There shall be no more buying of gowns and fripperies. You hear? It is for the wife to come to the husband for the money, not for her to waste it wantonly on gowns, like a creature of the streets. You," his voice was an insult, "you, with your wrinkles and your faded eyes and a gown of—" he turned inquiringly toward me. "How does one call it, that color, Frau Orme?" There came a blur of tears to my eyes. "It is called ashes of roses," I answered. "Ashes of roses." Konrad Nirlanger threw back his head and laughed a laugh as stinging as a whiplash. "Ashes of roses! So! It is well named. For my dear wife it is poetically fit, is it not so? For see, her roses are but withered ashes. Eh, Anna?" Deliberately and in silence Anna Nirlanger walked to the mirror and stood there, gazing at the woman in the glass. There was something dreadful and portentous about the calm and studied deliberation with which she critically viewed that reflection. She lifted her arms slowly and patted into place the locks that had become disarranged, turning her head from side to side to study the effect. Then she took from a drawer the bit of chamois skin that I had given her, and passed it lightly over her eyelids and cheeks, humming softly to herself the while. No music ever sounded so uncanny to my ears. The woman before the mirror looked at the woman in the mirror with a long, steady, measuring look. Then slowly and deliberately, the long, graceful folds of her lovely gown trailing behind her, she walked over to where her frowning husband stood. So might a queen have walked, head held high, gaze steady. She stopped within half a foot of him, her eyes level with his. For a long half minute they stood thus, the faded blue eyes of the wife gazing into the sullen black eyes of the husband, and his were the first to drop, for all the noble blood in Anna Nirlanger's veins, and all her long line of gently bred ancestors were coming to her aid in dealing with her middle-class husband. "You forget," she said, very slowly and distinctly. "If this were Austria, instead of America, you would not forget. In Austria people of your class do not speak in this manner to those of my caste." "Unsinn!" laughed Konrad Nirlanger. "This is Amerika." "Yes," said Anna Nirlanger, "this is Amerika. And in Amerika all things are different. I see now that my people knew of what they spoke when they called me mad to think of wedding a clod of the people, such as you." For a moment I thought that he was going to strike her. I think he would have if she had flinched. But she did not. Her head was held high and her eyes did not waver. "I married you for love. It is most comical, is it not? With you I thought I should find peace and happiness and a rebirth of the intellect that was being smothered in the splendor and artificiality and the restrictions of my life there. Well, I was wrong. But wrong. Now hear me." Her voice was tense with passion. "There will be gowns. As many and as rich as I choose. You have said many times that the ladies of America you admire. And see, I shall be also one of those so admired ladies. My money shall go for gowns, for hats, for trifles of lace and velvet and fur. You shall learn that it is not a peasant woman whom you have married. This is Amerika, the land of the free, my husband. And see, who is more of Amerika than I? Who?" She laughed a high little laugh and came over to me, taking my hands in her own. "Dear girl, you must run quickly and dress, for this evening we shall go to the theater. Oh, but you must. There shall be no unpleasantness, that I promise. My husband accompanies us, with joy. Is it not so, Konrad? With joy? So." Wildly I longed to decline, but I dared not, so I only nodded, for fear of the great lump in my throat, and taking Frau Knapf's hand, I turned and fled with her. Frau Knapf was muttering, "Du Hund! Du unverständiger Hund, du!" in good Billingsgate German, and wiping her eyes with her apron. And I dressed with trembling fingers because I dared not otherwise face the brave little Austrian, the plucky little aborigine who, with the donning of the new Amerikanish gown, had acquired some real Amerikanish nerve. End of Chapter 10. Of Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lee Ann Howlett. Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed, by Edna Ferber. Chapter 11. Von Gerhard Speaks. Of Von Gerhard I had not had a glimpse since that evening of my hysterical outburst. On Christmas Day there had come a box of roses so huge that I could not find vases enough to hold its contents, although I pressed into service everything from mason jars from the kitchen to hand-painted atrocities from the parlor. After I had given posies to Frau Nirlanger and fastened a rose in Frau Knapf's hard knob of hair, where it bobbed in ludicrous discomfort, I still had enough to fill the wash-bowl. My room looked like a grand opera star's boudoir when she is expecting the newspaper reporters. I reveled in the glowing fragrance of the blossoms and felt very Eastern and luxurious and popular. It had been a busy, happy, work-filled week in which I had had to snatch odd moments for the selecting of certain wonderful toys for the Spalpeens. There had been dolls and doll clothes, and a marvelous miniature kitchen for the practical and stolid Sheila, and ingenious bits of mechanism that did unbelievable things when wound up for the clever, imaginative Hans. I was not to have the joy of seeing their wide-eyed delight, but I knew that there would follow certain laboriously scrawled letters, filled with topsy-turvy capitals and crazily leaning words of thanks to the doting old auntie who had been such good fun the summer before. Boarding-house Christmases had become an old story. I had learned to accept them, even to those obscure and foreign parts of Turkey which are seen only on boarding-house plates, and which would be recognized nowhere else as belonging to that stately bird. Christmas at Knapf's had been a happy surprise, a day of hearty good cheer and kindness. There had even been a Christmas tree, hung with stodgy German angels and Pfeffernusse and pink frosted cakes. I found myself the bewildered recipient of gifts from everyone, from the Knapfs and the aborigines, and even from one of the crushed-looking wives. The aborigine whom they called Fritz had presented me with a huge and imposing Lebkuchen, reposing in a box with frilled border, ornamented with quaint little red and green German figures in sugar, and labeled Nuremberg in stout letters, for it had come all the way from that Kuchen-famous city. The Lebkuchen I placed on my mantel-shelf as befitted so magnificent a work of art. It was quite too elaborate and imposing to be sent in the way of ordinary food, although it had a certain tantalizingly spicy scent that tempted one to break off a corner here and there. On the afternoon of Christmas Day I sat down to thank Dr. Von Gerhard for the flowers as prettily as might be. Also I asked his pardon, a thing not hard to do with the perfume of his roses filling the room. For you, I wrote, who are so wise in the ways of those tricky things called nerves, must know that it was only a mild hysteria that made me say those most unladylike things. I have written Norah all about it. She has replied, advising me to stick to the good fellow role but not to dress the part. So when next you see me I shall be a perfectly safe and sane comrade in petticoats. And I promise you, no more outbursts. So it happened that on the afternoon of New Year's Day Von Gerhard and I gravely wished one another many happy and impossible things for the coming year, looking fairly and squarely into each other's eyes as we did so. "So," said Von Gerhard, as one who is satisfied, "the nerves are steady today. What do you say to a brisk walk along the lake shore to put us in a New Year frame of mind, and then a supper downtown somewhere with a toast to Max and Norah?" "You've saved my life. Sit down here in the parlor and gaze at the crepe paper oranges while I powder my nose and get into some street clothes. I have such a story to tell you. It has made me quite contented with my lot." The story was that of the Nirlangers, and as we struggled against a brisk lake breeze I told it, and partly because of the breeze, and partly because of the story, there were tears in my eyes when I had finished. Von Gerhard stared at me, aghast. "But you are crying!" he marveled, watching a tear slide down my nose. "I'm not," I retorted. "Anyway, I know it. I think I may blubber if I choose to, mayn't I, as well as other women?" "Blubber?" repeated Von Gerhard, he of the careful and cautious English. "But most certainly, if you wish. I had thought that newspaper women did not indulge in the luxury of tears." "They don't, often. Haven't the time. If a woman reporter were to burst into tears every time she saw something to weep over, she'd be going about with a red nose and puffy eyelids half the time. Scarcely a day passes that does not bring her face to face with human suffering in some form. Not only must she see these things, but she must write of them so that those who read can also see them. And just because she does not wail and tear her hair and faint, she popularly is supposed to be a flinty, cigarette-smoking creature who rampages up and down the land, seeking whom she may rend with her pen, and gazing dry-eyed upon scenes of horrid bloodshed." "And yet the little domestic tragedy of the Nirlangers can bring tears to your eyes?" "Oh, that was quite different. The case of the Nirlangers had nothing to do with Dawn O'Hara, newspaper reporter. It was just plain Dawn O'Hara, woman, who witnessed that little tragedy. Mein Himmel! Are all German husbands like that?" "Not all. I have a very good friend named Max." "Oh, Max! Max is an angel husband. Fancy Max and Norah waxing tragic on the subject of a gown. Now you—" "I? Come, you are sworn to good fellowship. As one comrade to another, tell me, what sort of husband do you think I should make, eh? The boorish Nirlanger sort, or the charming Max variety? Come, tell me, you who always have seemed so damnably able to take care of yourself." His eyes were twinkling in the maddening way they had. I looked out across the lake to where a line of whitecaps was piling up formidably only to break in futile wrath against the solid wall of the shore. And there came over me an equally futile wrath, that savage, unreasoning instinct in women which prompts them to hurt those whom they love. "Oh, you!" I began, with Von Gerhard's amused eyes laughing down upon me. "I should say that you would be more in the Nirlanger style, in your large, immovable, Germansure way. Not that you would stoop to wrangle about money or gowns, but that you would control those things. Your wife will be a placid, blonde, rather plump German Fraulein of excellent family and no imagination. Men of your type always select negative wives. 20 years ago she would have run to bring you your Zeitung and your slippers. She would be that kind, if Zeitung and slipper husbands still were in existence. You will be fond of her, in a patronizing sort of way, and she will never know the difference between that and being loved, not having a great deal of imagination, as I have said before. And you will go on becoming more and more famous, and she will grow plumper and more placid, and less understanding of what those commish medical journals have to say so often about her husband who is always discovering things. And you will live happily ever after." A hand gripped my shoulder. I looked up, startled, into two blue eyes blazing down into mine. Von Gerhard's face was a painful red. I think that the hand on my shoulder even shook me a little, there on that bleak and deserted lake drive. I tried to wrench my shoulder free with a jerk. "You are hurting me!" I cried. A quiver of pain passed over the face that I had thought so calmly unemotional. "You talk of hurts! You, who set out deliberately and maliciously to make me suffer! How dare you, then, talk to me like this? You stab with 100 knives. You, who know how I—" "I'm sorry," I put in contritely. "Please don't be so dreadful about it. After all, you asked me, didn't you? Perhaps I've hurt your vanity. There, I didn't mean that either. Oh, dear, let's talk about something impersonal. We get along wretchedly of late." The angry red ebbed away from Von Gerhard's face. The blaze of wrath in his eyes gave way to a deeper, brighter light that held me fascinated, and there came to his lips a smile of rare sweetness. The hand that had grasped my shoulder slipped down, until it met my hand and gripped it. "Na, ist schon recht, Kindchen. Those that we most care for we would hurt always. When I have told you of my love for you, although already you know it, then you will tell me. Hush! Do not deny this thing. There shall be no more lies between us. There shall be only the truth, and no more about plump, blonde German wives who run with Zeitung and slippers. After all, it is no secret. 3 months ago I told Norah. It was not news to her. But she trusted me." I felt my face to be as white and as tense as his own. "Norah knows?" "It is better to speak these things. Then there need be no shifting of the eyes, no evasive words, no tricks, no subterfuge." We had faced about, and were retracing our steps past the rows of peculiarly homelike houses that line Milwaukee's magnificent lake shore. Windows were hung with holiday scarlet and holly, and here and there a face was visible at a window, looking out at the man and woman walking swiftly along the wind-swept heights that rose far above the lake. A wretched revolt seized me as I gazed at the substantial comfort of those normal, happy homes. "Why did you tell me? What good can that do? At least we were make-believe friends before. Suppose I were to tell you that I care, then what?" "I do not ask you to tell me," Von Gerhard replied quietly. "You need not. You know. You knew long, long ago. You know I love the big quietness of you, and your sureness, and the German way you have of twisting your sentences about, and the steady grip of your great firm hands, and the rareness of your laugh, and the simplicity of you. Why, I love the very cleanliness of your ruddy skin, and the way your hair grows away from your forehead, and your walk, and your voice, and oh, what is the use of it all?" "Just this, Dawn. The light of day sweetens all things. We have dragged this thing out into the sunlight, where, if it grows, it will grow sanely and healthily. It was but an ugly, distorted, unsightly thing, sending out pale, unhealthy shoots in the dark, unwholesome cellars of our inner consciences. Norah's knowing was the cleanest, sweetest thing about it." "How wonderfully you understand her, and how right you are. Her knowing seems to make it as it should be, doesn't it? I am braver already for the knowledge of it. It shall make no difference between us?" "There is no difference, Dawn," said he. "No. It is only in the story books that they sigh, and groan, and utter silly nonsense. We are not like that. Perhaps after a bit you will meet someone you care for greatly, not plump or blond or German, perhaps, but still—" "Doch, you are flippant?" "I must say those things to keep the tears back. You would not have me wailing here in the street. Tell me just one thing, and there shall be no more fluttering breaths and languishing looks. Tell me, when did you begin to care?" We had reached Knapf's doorstep. The short winter day was already drawing to its close. In the half light Von Gerhard's eyes glowed luminous. "Since the day I first met you at Norah's," he said simply. I stared at him, aghast, my ever-present sense of humor struggling to the surface. "Not on that day when you came into the room where I sat in the chair by the window, with a flowered quilt humped about my shoulders, and a fever sore twisting my mouth, and my complexion the color of cheese, and my hair plastered back from my forehead, and my eyes like boiled onions." "Thank God for your gift of laughter," Von Gerhard said, and took my hand in his for one brief moment before he turned and walked away. Quite prosaically I opened the big front door at Knapf's to find Herr Knapf standing in the hallway with his "N'Abend, Frau Orme," and there was the sane and soothing scent of Wiener Schnitzel and spluttering things in the air. And I ran upstairs to my room and turned on all the lights and looked at the starry-eyed creature in the mirror. Then I took the biggest, newest photograph of Norah from the mantel and looked at her for a long, long minute, while she looked back at me in her brave, true way. "Thank you, dear," I said to her. "Thank you. Would you think me stagey and silly if I were to kiss you, just once, on your beautiful, trusting eyes?" A telephone bell tinkled downstairs, and Herr Knapf stationed himself at the foot of the stairs and roared my name. When I had picked up the receiver, "This is Ernst," said the voice at the other end of the wire. "I have just remembered that I had asked you downtown for supper." "I would rather thank God fasting," I replied, very softly, and hung the receiver on its hook. Chapter 11. Of Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lee Ann Howlett. Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed, by Edna Ferber. Chapter 12. Bennie the Consoler. In a corner of Frau Nirlanger's bedroom, sheltered from draughts and glaring light, is a little wooden bed, painted blue and ornamented with stout red roses that are faded by time and much abuse. Every evening at 8 o'clock, 3 anxious-browed women hold low-spoken conclave about the quaint old bed, while its occupant sleeps and smiles as he sleeps, and clasps to his breast a chewed-looking woolly dog. For a new joy has come to the sad little Frau Nirlanger, and I, quite by accident, was the cause of bringing it to her. The queer little blue bed, with its faded roses, was brought down from the attic by Frau Knapf, for she is one of the 3 foster mothers of the small occupant of the bed. The occupant of the bed is named Bennie, and a corporation formed for the purpose of bringing him up in the way he should go is composed of Don O'Hara Orme, president and distracted guardian; Mrs. Conrad Nirlanger, cuddler-in-chief and authority on the subject of Bennie's bedtime; Mr. Blackie Griffith, good angel, general cut-up, and monitor often Bennie's neckties and toys; Dr. Ernst Von Gerhard, chief medical adviser, and sweller of the exchequer, with the privilege of selecting all candies. Members of the corporation meet with great frequency evenings and Sundays, much to the detriment of a certain book in the making with which Don O'Hara Orme was wont to struggle o' evenings. Bennie had been one of those little tragedies that find their way into juvenile court. Bennie's story was common enough, but Bennie himself had been different. 10 minutes after his first appearance in the courtroom everyone, from the big bald judge to the newest probation officer, had fallen in love with him. Somehow, you wanted to smooth the hair from his forehead, tip his pale little face upward, and very gently kiss his smooth white brow. Which alone was enough to distinguish Bennie, for juvenile court children as a rule are distinctly not kissable. Bennie's mother was accused of being unfit to care for her boy, and Bennie was temporarily installed in the detention home. There the superintendent and his plump and kindly wife had fallen head over heels in love with him, and had dressed him in a smart little Norfolk suit and a frivolous plaid silk tie. There were delays in the case, and postponement after postponement, so that Bennie appeared in the courtroom every Tuesday for 4 weeks. The reporters, and the probation officers and policemen became very chummy with Bennie, and showered him with bright new pennies and certain wonderful candies. Superintendent Arnett of the detention home was as proud of the boy as though he were his own; and when Bennie would look shyly and questioningly into his face for permission to accept the proffered offerings, the big superintendent would chuckle delightedly. Bennie had a strangely mobile face for such a baby, and the whitest, smoothest brow I have ever seen. The comedy and tears and misery and laughter of the big white-walled courtroom were too much for Bennie. He would gaze about with puzzled blue eyes; then, giving up the situation as something too vast for his comprehension, he would fall to drawing curlicues on a bit of paper with a great yellow pencil presented him by one of the newspaper men. Every Tuesday the rows of benches were packed with a motley crowd of Poles, Russians, Slavs, Italians, Greeks, Lithuanians, a crowd made up of fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, neighbors, friends, and enemies of the boys and girls whose fate was in the hands of the big man seated in the revolving chair up in front. But Bennie's mother was not of this crowd, this pitiful, ludicrous crowd filling the great room with the stifling, rancid odor of the poor. Nor was Bennie. He sat, clear-eyed and unsmiling, in the depths of a great chair on the court side of the railing, and gravely received the attentions of the lawyers and reporters and courtroom attachés who had grown fond of the grave little figure. Then, on the 5th Tuesday, Bennie's mother appeared. How she had come to be that child's mother, God only knows, or perhaps he had had nothing to do with it. She was terribly sober and frightened. Her face was swollen and bruised, and beneath one eye there was a puffy green and blue swelling. Her sordid story was common enough as the probation officer told it. The woman had been living in one wretched room with the boy. Her husband had deserted her. There was no food and little furniture. The queer feature of it, said the probation officer, was that the woman managed to keep the boy fairly neat and clean, regardless of her own condition, and he generally had food of some sort, although the mother sometimes went without food for days. Through the squalor and misery and degradation of her own life, Bennie had somehow been kept unsullied, a thing apart. "Hm," said Judge Wheeling, and looked at Bennie. Bennie was standing beside his mother. He was very quiet, and his eyes were smiling up into those of the battered creature who was fighting for him. "I guess we'll have to take you out of this," the judge decided abruptly. "That boy is too good to go to waste." The sodden, dazed woman before him did not immediately get the full meaning of his words. She still stood there, swaying a bit, and staring unintelligently at the judge. Then, quite suddenly, she realized it. She took a quick step forward. Her hand went up to her breast, to her throat, to her lips, with an odd, stifled gesture. "You ain't going to take him away from me? No, you wouldn't do that, would you? Not for always? You wouldn't do that, you wouldn't?" Judge Wheeling waved her away, but the woman dropped to her knees. "Judge, give me a chance. I'll stop drinking. Only don't take him away from me. Don't, Judge, don't. He's all I've got in the world. Give me a chance. 3 months, 6 months, a year." "Get up," ordered Judge Wheeling gruffly, "and stop that. It won't do you a bit of good." And then a wonderful thing happened. The woman rose to her feet. A new and strange dignity had come into her battered face. The lines of suffering and vice were erased as by magic, and she seemed to grow taller, younger, almost beautiful. When she spoke again it was slowly and distinctly, her words quite free from the blur of the bar room and street vernacular. "I tell you, you must give me a chance. You cannot take a child from a mother in this way. I tell you, if you will only help me I can crawl back up the road that I've traveled. I was not always like this. There was another life before oh, since then there have been years of blackness and hunger and cold and worse, but I never dragged the boy into it. Look at him." Our eyes traveled from the woman's transfigured face to that of the boy. We could trace a wonderful likeness where before we had seen none, but the woman went on in her steady, even tone. "I can't talk as I should, because my brain isn't clear. It's the drink. When you drink you forget. But you must help me. I can't do it alone. I can remember how to live straight, just as I can remember how to talk straight. Let me show you that I'm not all bad. Give me a chance. Take the boy and then give him back to me when you are satisfied. I'll try. God only knows how I'll try. Only don't take him away forever, Judge. Don't do that." Judge Wheeling ran an uncomfortable finger around his collar's edge. "Any friends living here?" "No, no." "Sure about that?" "Quite sure." "Now see here. I'm going to give you your chance. I shall take this boy away from you for a year. In that time you will stop drinking and become a decent, self-supporting woman. You will be given in charge of one of these probation officers. She will find work for you, and a good home, and she'll stand by you, and you must report to her. If she is satisfied with you at the end of the year, the boy goes back to you." "She will be satisfied," the woman said simply. She stooped and taking Bennie's face between her hands kissed him once. Then she stepped aside and stood quite still, looking after the little figure that passed out of the courtroom with his hand in that of a big, kindly police officer. She looked until the big door had opened and closed upon them. Then, well, it was just another newspaper story. It made a good one. That evening I told Frau Nirlanger about it, and she wept, softly, and murmured, "Ach, das arm baby! Like my little Oscar he is, without a mother." I told Ernst about him, too, and Blackie, because I could not get his grave little face out of my mind. I wondered if those who had charge of him now would take the time to bathe the little body, and brush the soft hair until it shone, and tie the gay plaid silk tie as lovingly as Daddy Arnett of the detention home had done. Then it was that I, quite unwittingly, stepped into Bennie's life. There was an anniversary, or a change in the board of directors, or a new coat of paint or something of the kind in one of the orphan homes, and the story fell to me. I found the orphan home to be typical of its kind, a big, dreary, prison-like structure. The woman at the door did not in the least care to let me in. She was a fish-mouthed woman with a hard eye, and as I told my errand her mouth grew fishier and the eye harder. Finally she led me down a long, dark, airless stretch of corridor, and departed in search of the matron, leaving me seated in the unfriendly reception room, with its straight-backed chairs placed stonily against the walls, beneath rows of red and blue and yellow religious pictures. Just as I was wondering why it seemed impossible to be holy and cheerful at the same time, there came a pad-padding down the corridor. The next moment the matron stood in the doorway. She was a mountainous, red-faced woman, with warts on her nose. "Good afternoon," I said, sweetly. "Ooh, what a brute," I thought. Then I began to explain my errand once more. "Criticism of the home?" "No, indeed," I assured her. At last, convinced of my disinterestedness, she reluctantly guided me about the big, gloomy building. There were endless flights of shiny stairs and endless stuffy, airless rooms, until we came to a door which she flung open, disclosing the nursery. It seemed to me that there were 100 babies, babies at every stage of development, of all sizes and ages and types. They glanced up at the opening of the door, and then a dreadful thing happened. Every child that was able to walk or creep scuttled into the farthest corners and remained quite, quite still, with a wide-eyed expression of fear and apprehension on every face. For a moment my heart stood still. I turned to look at the woman by my side. Her thin lips were compressed into a straight, hard line. She said a word to a nurse standing near, and began to walk about, eyeing the children sharply. She put out a hand to pat the head of one red-haired mite in a soiled pinafore, but before her hand could descend I saw the child dodge, and the tiny hand flew up to the head as though in defense. "They are afraid of her," my sick heart told me. "Those babies are afraid of her. What does she do to them? I can't stand this. I'm going." I mumbled a hurried thank you to the fat matron as I turned to leave the big bare room. At the head of the stairs there was a great black door. I stopped before it, God knows why, and pointed toward it. "What is in that room?" I asked. Since then I have wondered many times at the unseen power that prompted me to put the question. The stout matron bustled on, rattling her keys as she walked. That's where we keep the incorrigibles." "May I see them?" I asked, again prompted by that inner voice. "There is only one." She grudgingly unlocked the door, using one of the great keys that swung from her waist. The heavy black door swung open. I stepped into the bare room, lighted dimly by one small window. In the farthest corner crouched something that stirred and glanced up at our entrance. It peered at us with an ugly look of terror and defiance, and I stared back at it in the dim light. During one dreadful, breathless second I remained staring, while my heart stood still. Then, "Bennie!" I cried, and stumbled toward him. "Bennie, boy!" The little unkempt figure, in its soiled knickerbocker suit, the sunny hair all uncared for, the gay plaid tie draggled and limp, rushed into my arms with a crazy, inarticulate cry. Down on my knees on the bare floor I held him close, close, and his arms were about my neck as though they never should unclasp. "Take me away, take me away!" His wet cheek was pressed against my own streaming one. "I want my mother. I want Daddy Arnett. Take me away." I wiped his cheeks with my notebook or something, picked him up in my arms, and started for the door. I had quite forgotten the fat matron. "What are you doing?" she asked, blocking the doorway with her huge bulk. "I'm going to take him back with me. Please let me. I'll take care of him until the year is up. He shan't bother you any more." "That is impossible," she said coldly. "He has been sent here by the court for a year, and he must stay here. Besides, he is a stubborn, uncontrollable child." "Uncontrollable? He's nothing of the kind. Why don't you treat him as a child should be treated, instead of like a little animal? You don't know him. Why, he's the most lovable and he's only a baby. Can't you see that? A baby!" She only stared her dislike, her little pig eyes grown smaller and more glittering. "You great big thing!" I shrieked at her, like an infuriated child. With the tears streaming down my cheeks I unclasped Bennie's cold hands from about my neck. He clung to me frantically, until I had to push him away and run. The woman swung the door shut and locked it. But for all its thickness I could hear Bennie's helpless fists pounding on its panels as I stumbled down the stairs, and Bennie's voice came faintly to my ears, muffled by the heavy door, as he shrieked to me to take him away to his mother and to Daddy Arnett. I blubbered all the way back in the car, until every one stared, but I didn't care. When I reached the office I made straight for Blackie's smoke-filled sanctum. When my tale was ended he let me cry all over his desk, with my head buried in a heap of galley proofs, and my tears watering his paste pot. He sat calmly by, smoking. Finally he began gently to philosophize. "Now, girl, he's prob'ly better off there than he ever was at home with his mother soused all the time. Maybe he give that warty matron friend of yours all kinds of trouble, yellin' for his ma." I raised my head from the desk. "Oh, you can talk! You didn't see him! What do you care? But if you could have seen him, crouched there alone, like a little animal. He was so sweet and lovable, and he hadn't been decently washed for weeks, and his arms clung to me. I can feel his hands about my neck." I buried my head in the papers again. Blackie went on smoking. There was no sound in the little room except the purring of Blackie's pipe. Then, "I done a favor for Wheeling once," mused he. I glanced up quickly. "Oh, Blackie, do you think " "No, I don't. But then again, you can't never tell. That was 4 or 5 years ago, and the memory of past favors grows dim fast. Still, if you're through waterin' the top of my desk, why, I'd like to set down and do a little real brisk talkin' over the phone. You're excused." Quite humbly I crept away, with hope in my heart. To this day I do not know what secret string the resourceful Blackie pulled. But the next afternoon I found a hastily scrawled note tucked into the roll of my typewriter. It sent me scuttling across the hall to the sporting editor's smoke-filled room. And there, on a chair beside the desk, surrounded by scrap-books, lead pencils, paste-pot, and odds and ends of newspaper office paraphernalia, sat Bennie. His hair was parted very smoothly on one side, and under his dimpled chin bristled a very new and extremely lively green and red plaid silk tie. The next instant I had swept aside papers, brushes, pencils, books, and Bennie was gathered close in my arms. Blackie, with a strange glow in his deep-set black eyes, regarded us with an assumed disgust. "Women is all alike. Ain't it the truth, I used to think you was different. But shucks, it ain't so. Got to turn on the weeps the minute you're tickled or mad. Why say, I ain't goin' to have you comin' in here and dampenin' up the whole place every little while. It's unhealthy for me, sittin' here in the wet." "Oh, shut up, Blackie," I said happily. "How in the world did you do it?" "Never you mind. The question is, what you goin' to do with him now you've got him? Goin' to have a French bunny for him, or fetch him up by hand? Wheeling appointed a probation skirt to look after the crowd of us, and we got to toe the mark." "Glory be!" I ejaculated. "I don't know what I shall do with him. I shall have to bring him down with me every morning, and perhaps you can make a sporting editor out of him." "Nix. Not with that forehead. He's a highbrow. We'll make him dramatic critic. In the meantime I'll be little fairy godmother, and if you'll get on your bonnet I'll stake you and the young'un to strawberry shortcake and chocolate ice cream." So it happened that a wondering Frau Knapf and a sympathetic Frau Nirlanger were called in for consultation an hour later. Bennie was ensconced in my room, very wide-eyed and wondering, but quite content. With the entrance of Frau Nirlanger the consultation was somewhat disturbed. She made a quick rush at him and gathered him in her hungry arms. "Du baby, du!" she cried. "Du kleiner!" And she was down on her knees, and somehow her figure had melted into delicious mother curves, with Bennie's head just fitting into that most gracious one between her shoulder and breast. She cooed to him in a babble of French and German and English, calling him her "leetle Oscar." Bennie seemed miraculously to understand. Perhaps he was becoming accustomed to having strange ladies snatch him to their breasts. "So," said Frau Nirlanger, looking up at us, "is he not sweet? He shall be my leetle boy, nicht? For one small year he shall be my own boy. Ach, I am but lonely all the long day here in this strange land. You will let me care for him, nicht? And Konrad, he will be very angry, but that shall make no bit of difference. Eh, Oscar?" And so the thing was settled, and an hour later 3 anxious-browed women were debating the weighty question of eggs or bread and milk for Bennie's supper. Frau Nirlanger was for soft-boiled eggs as being none too heavy after orphan asylum fare. I was for bread and milk, that being the prescribed supper dish for all the orphans and waifs that I had ever read about, from the wide, wide world to Helen's babies and back again. Frau Knapf was for both eggs and bread and milk with a dash of meat and potatoes thrown in for good measure, and a slice or so of Koukin on the side. We compromised on 1 egg, 1 glass of milk, and a slice of lavishly buttered bread and jelly. It was a clean, sweet, sleepy-eyed Bennie that we tucked between the sheets. We 3 women stood looking down at him as he lay there in the quaint, old blue-painted bed that had once held the plump little Knapfs. "You think anyway he had enough supper?" mused the anxious-browed Frau Knapf. "To school he will have to go, yes?" murmured Frau Nirlanger, regretfully. I tucked in the covers at one side of the bed, not that they needed tucking, but because it was such a comfortable, satisfying thing to do. "Just at this minute," I said as I tucked, "I'd rather be a newspaper reporter than anything else in the world. As a profession 'tis so broadenin', and at the same time so chancy." End of chapter 12.